Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Reba Coker. I am the collections manager at the Johnson-Humrickhouse Museum. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Scott Butler. Dr. Butler holds a PhD in astrophysics and quantum mechanics, and he has a professional career in corporate real estate finance. As you can see, he has dedicated his life to research, and although he resides in Massachusetts, there is no surprise his area of focus is where his roots are planted the deepest. Coshocton County has been home of the Butler family dating back all the way to the 18th century. Dr. Butler's books, lectures, they both opened an opportunity for our local community to learn the true facts about our history. And these facts are usually shrouded in mystery and legend. So we're really excited that every year he comes back and gives us more information. He also sponsors the Mary Harris Prize Essay Contest. They are an extraordinary gift that offers an outlet for local writers to remove themselves from their daily lives, dig into the past, and ask their own questions about our history. The winners of the 2020 essay contest will be announced tonight after his lecture. Dr. Butler, we want to thank you for your research and offering the prizes. Before I get into the fun part and actually let him, speak, I do want to talk a second about using Zoom as a platform. We are recording the lecture because we're going to post it on YouTube and then on our website for people who weren't able to make it tonight. And the video quality does sometimes deteriorate with multiple people on. So we want to make sure that your camera is turned off during the lecture, and we're going to keep your mics muted just so we're minimizing distraction for everybody else attending. If you have a question, you can use the chat box and I'll be monitoring it. So I'll make sure that those questions will get answered later. And he's also doing a Q&A session at the end. And then during the Q&A session, you'll be able to actually unmute yourself and you could turn your cameras on and we can actually see each other and talk that way. So now we can get to the fun part and he can go ahead and start his lecture. Thank you.
Okay, this lecture is based on a new book which just was released today, actually. And the title of the book is Frontier History of Coshocton, and it covers 16,000 years of Coshocton history. And I am going to pretty much cover the highlights in this lecture, but I urge you to read the book to get all the interesting details, because the people are really the most important thing, and I can't go into that in a 1-hour talk. 16,000 years we're covering from the end of the last ice age until the end of the War of 1812, when the frontier moved far west. Now we have pretty good archaeological records for the first 16,000 years or so. And then we have superb writings for about a little over the last 100 years of that period. So the amount of history that's known and documentable about Coshocton is really, really remarkable. So let's move on. This slide is not in the book, but I wanted to show it to you to give you an understanding of how many things have changed over this 16,000 years. And oddly, the public doesn't really get to see this raw data very much, and I don't know why. But on the axis on the left is temperature, which is determined by the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16. And I should have mentioned that this is determined by drilling ice cores in central Greenland, where they can drill these huge, very deep ice cores and determine the temperature when the ice or the snow was laid down from this isotope ratio. And you can count the years simply by counting layers in the core. So this is extremely accurate and detailed. So here's 16,000 years. Now, on the bottom is the age before present. And over here, every one of these grid lines is 1,000 years. And so over here is 16,000 years. You can see we're deep in the ice ages. And then there's a quick bounce up and down and out. And then about 10,000 years ago, which is the beginning of the Neolithic period, where the North America enters a warming period. And this, again, the central Greenland tracks pretty well with North America, although the absolute levels change. So then we have 8,000 years or so of a fairly warm period with some pretty substantial variations. And this variation is about 5 degrees centigrade, which is about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And minus 30 Celsius, by the way, is minus 22 Fahrenheit. So that's the air temperature when the snow is laid down. Now here, we'll spend most of the time on this the last 2,000 years, and I'll go into more detail on that. But you can see over this, there's been a lot of changes, but in a certain sense, it's been fairly stable for 10,000 years in North America, with some significant moves. Okay, here's one of my favorite Latin phrases, which Coshoctonia est omnis divisa tres partes, which is adapted from Julius Caesar's famous sentence in the Gallic Wars, and it means Coshoctonia is a whole divided into 3 parts. And what I've coined this term Coshoctonia is the name of a region. The region is Coshocton County and the adjacent counties. So you've got Coshocton County and Muskingum, Guernsey, Tuscarawas, Holmes, Knox, and Licking County. And so we're going to cover the history of that whole region, and I call that Coshoctonia. And the 3 parts are the 3 river valleys, the Wohunding River, the Tuscarawas River, and the Muskingum River. And different elements of the history occur in different regions, different of those river valleys, but they're all very important. Now, people did visit Coshoctonia 16,000 years ago. There's proof. The last glacier did not cover Coshocton County, although it certainly would have been very cold with a big wall of ice only a few miles away. Now, there's a archaeological site called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in western Pennsylvania, and the deepest layers in that site date to 16,000 years ago. And they have found in those deep layers flint tools from the Upper Mercer Flint of Coshocton County. Those deposits are near Nellie, and I was honored by a visit to the site of those, and you can see one of the flint pits in the picture, and the landowner standing next to it, and it's filled with water, and the entire hillside is pockmarked with these flint pits. So these people are called the pre-Clovis people, and they really weren't very well known until recently. But this is proof that Native Americans visited Coshocton County, mined the flint, and made tools, and some of them made their way to that Meadowcroft Rock Shelter 16,000 years ago. Now, the next peoples to come into the Coshocton area came about 13,000 years ago, and they're called the Clovis peoples because of their unique and special toolkit, which was innovative for the time. And this is a picture of one of the spear points, and a Clovis point basically has this fluted base. And the term point, by the way, just means what we might have used to call an arrowhead or a spearhead, but it's a pointed piece of flint that is made to flint affixed to a haft. Now, there was much activity in Coshoctonia because most of the Clovis points in Ohio, the whole state of Ohio, are made from this Upper Mercer Flint. And more Clovis points are found in Coshocton than any other county. Now, archaeologists have done quite an amount of work in Coshoctonia. Professor Nigel Brush and James Morton and some others have really done a lot in the last 50 years or so. And Professor Brush was kind enough to lend me or give me a big stack of his archaeology papers to read. And that's where I learned a lot of this. And plus there's other books and things. But Professor Brush's work has proven that people lived in Coshoctonia more or less continuously for that entire 13,000 years. Now let's look at the last 2,000 years or so now. And here's a little piece of that chart I showed you before. Here's the last 2,000 years. Now you all probably remember about the Adena and Hopewell cultures of the mound builders, and those ran from about 400 BC to 400 AD. And just for reference, 400 BC is the time of ancient Athens, and 400 AD is around when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. And what happened is around 400 AD, the Hopewell culture collapsed. And that actually corresponds to a time period called the Dark Ages Cold Period from 400 to 700 AD. And you can see that in this Greenland data as it, just a second, I have to admit somebody. You can see that in this Greenland data, this a fairly warm period here around 2,000 years ago, which is 0 AD. And then the temperature falls into this, my cursor keeps going away. Down here is the Dark Ages Cold Period. There's a decline in temperature. So probably Coshoctonia suffered shorter growing seasons and less rainfall. Now these ages I'm giving you, these names, Dark Ages and the time periods, that's based on Ohio archaeology. It's got nothing to do, it's not based on global warming or any other global issues. That's Ohio archaeology, but they do match up pretty well with this detailed chart from central Greenland of the temperatures. And then there was a spike up. The medieval warm period began in 700 AD, ran till about 1300 AD, and the population and the number of towns and villages in Coshocton and all of southern Ohio increased considerably. But then 1300 AD, the Little Ice Age began. And that time period corresponded to a complete abandonment of Coshoctonia. All the villages went away. There were no sites for 200 years. It seems like the people moved to the Ohio River area, and there still were sites down there. But in 1500, Coshoctonia was reoccupied. Now that period, 1500 to 1700 AD, in Ohio is called the Wellsburg period, And there are many sites in Coshoctonia called Wellsburg sites, and I'll just want to point out one of them. It's named the Collison site. It was excavated by Nigel Brush and another fellow named Jeff Dilliard. It's opposite Warsaw. I've actually seen the site. It's basically a cornfield now, but at some point they excavated it. They found things dated to radiocarbon dating to 1632. And they found storage pits and scrapers and stone knives and many, many points. And they also found this really wonderful petroglyph, which they called the Warsaw Warrior. And you can see it over here. There's a man, here's his head etched into the stone. Here's his body and his legs are down here. And here in his left hand, he's holding what's either a shield or a drum. And in his right hand, he's holding what's either a war club or a rattle. So he's either dancing or he's showing off his war style. But the site actually has no signs of violence. So it's possible the dancing explanation works better, but we really don't know. Now also found were 2 copper beads and part of an iron buckle. So dating 1632, this site clearly had trade contact with either Canada or the Atlantic Ocean areas where they could get these items which are European origin. Okay, so 1650, Ohio, from a historian's point of view, is a blank slate, it's empty. But that's not because there were no one living there. And here you can see in this map, this is a linguistic map, there we go. Over here is basically an empty area. Now we know, obviously, from the Wellsburg period, there are people living here. The archaeologists tell us that, but the historians can't find any descriptions as to who they are. There are some clues that these are Algonquian-speaking peoples, and they lived there in Coshoctonia and also on the Ohio River. And they could well be the Shawnee, who later were driven away. So in 1650, what happened is the Beaver Wars began. And those were wars which the Iroquois Nation, which was a very powerful federation located in upstate New York over here, they obtained access to Dutch firearms and then were able to go and conquer and destroy all their neighbors for hundreds of miles. They cleared the areas, they cleared the Huron, they cleared the Ontario Peninsula, they cleared Michigan, they defeated the Erie, and continued to push west for hundreds of miles, drove out the Illinois. And they basically were clearing out the entire area. And they probably are the ones who cleared out the Algonquian peoples in Ohio, but we don't know. There's no evidence of that. However, at this time, the French realized they were losing control of Canada, of this area. They were losing their trade partners, and they started supplying firearms to their friends. And some of these nations are very large, very powerful nations, like the Chippewa. And let me admit somebody here. There we go. Okay. Once the Chippewa and the Ottawa obtained good firearms, they began defeating the Iroquois and drove them back all the way back to New York, and were attacking their towns. And the Iroquois population was falling. They were losing the war. So they had to have peace, and the French wanted peace as well. And so there was a great peace conference in 1701 in Montreal with 36 Indian nations, which declared peace. There'd be no more attacks to destroy villages, and Ohio basically became a common hunting ground. It was, by this time, no one was living there. It was empty. However, and it stayed empty for at least 30 years or so. There's not really much evidence of anyone moving to Ohio for a while. It was used as a hunting ground and transit area. But we know that in 1746, there were people living there. This is a map from Paris drawn in 1746, and you can see down here in Ohio, there's Rivière des Femmes Blanches. Now, in English, that means River of the White Women, and so we know who those are. And the names, that name is applied to the Wahunding and Muskingum rivers. And that's Mary Harris and her family. They clearly came to Ohio about 1745, and she's actually the first known identifiable Ohioan. She didn't come alone. Other records show that about 100 other Kanawha Mohawks came to Ohio. And they seem to have been encouraged to come to Ohio by the French, who wanted the area populated by friendly Indians who would trade with them. Now, I've shown this map before. It's a scholarly map of migration to Ohio. And what we want to do is look at this part of it here, this western part here, and focus more on that, because there were two groups came to Ohio 1739 to 1748. The Wyandotte came to Sandusky, and I don't know why my cursor keeps going. There it comes. And the Miami came to Pickawillany. They built a town there in Pickawillany. And the question you might ask is, why did they come? Well, there was a trade war that began. The English goods attracted the Western Indians to come to Ohio. They wanted access to English goods. The prices were 1/2 of French prices, and the quality was higher. And they also had things like large woolen blankets, which were not available from the French. Now you can imagine that something that once cost you 2 deer skins now costs you 1 is a huge difference in your standard of living. And so these goods were very, very attractive to the Indians. And the goods came from English traders from Pennsylvania, notably George Croghan, who was the best and biggest. And they flowed from the Logstown, which was a town near the forks of the Ohio, Pittsburgh, to the Cuyahoga River, and then to the Wyandottes in Sandusky. And they also flowed down the Ohio River to the Miamis at Pickawillany. And so what happened, of course, the Wyandottes they moved to Sandusky. They needed to get closer to those goods, and the Miamis moved to Pickawillany. This is what attracted the Indians to Ohio. Now, the French had to stop this, or they were going to lose control of the whole area. They needed the profits of the trade in order to finance New France. They sent soldiers to Sandusky, and they threatened Pickawillany to eliminate the trade. In the spring of 1748, the Wyandottes had to make a choice to either submit to the French or get away. And they chose to flee. They burnt their town at Sandusky. And this band, which is led by a chief named Nicholas, and his Wyandotte name is Orantandi, with 100 warriors and families, they fled east towards the English traders. Now, where did they go? Well, we know that 30 went to Logstown. Again, that's near Pittsburgh. and they wanted English and Iroquois help. And we know they went there because they met Conrad Weiser, who was a diplomat from Pennsylvania, and he kept a diary. And he wrote on September 6th of 1748, had a council with the Wandats, otherwise called Iontandi Hagas. Now in the Wyandot language, that means followers of Orantandi. This word Iontadi is corrupted a bit because this is translated from Seneca, and there is no R in Seneca at that time. And so they were very friendly, but let's then ask, where did the rest of them go? Well, the Wyandots in Logstown told us, they said there were 100 fighting men that came over to join the English. 70 were left behind at another town a good distance off, and they hoped they would follow them. Well, they didn't. But the shorter answer is these 70 warriors, they were left at the forks of the Muskingum, where they founded Coshocton, which is the first Coshocton. It's a town, a Wyandot town at the forks of the Muskingum. And we know that because we have another diary of Lieutenant Joseph Chazagros Deliri, a French engineer who was traveling through the area in 1755, and he knew all about Coshocton, and he traveled through it. He was assigned to Detroit and then ordered to go to where Fort Duquesne was being built so he could help with the fortifications. And here's his diary, which we have. This is the original diary. It's in a museum in Quebec, and I was able to purchase a electronic copy. And this is one little bit of that diary. And let me get my cursor going. And here you can see written in French in his script handwriting, Rivière Coshocton. And here's the flow of the river. This is the Walhunding River flowing upwards towards the another river called the Rivière Niger-Conan, which means river of beavers. And that's the Tuscarawas River. And so his path, he's going down the river, and here's the town, Coshocton, which is, and then he turns upriver in his path to Logstown to go this way. This is about where Canal Louisville is today, and this you can see the rivers, and what the word, the Coshocton is where one, in the journey to Logstown, where one goes upriver. If you continue downriver, you end up with the Ohio River. You don't get to where you want to go. So it's a very important direction. It's a very important place. And that's, in fact, what Coshocton means in the Wyandot language, where one goes upriver. Okay. Well, this town, Coshocton, is the same town that Christopher Gist visited in 1751. And at that time, it had 100 houses. And you figuring one warrior per house, and you multiply by 5 to get an idea how many people live there. So you had a town of about 500 people. Well, when Deliri goes through it in 1755, it's empty. There's only 2 houses occupied with a couple people. So what happened? Well, 1752 happened, which was a disastrous year. The French started the war. They sent an army and destroyed Pickawillany, the Miami town, and arrested the English traders. This battle in Pickawillany was the first battle of the French and Indian War, which became the 7 Years' War in Europe, which in terms of its global scope was really the First World War. So the First World War started in Ohio at Pickawillany in 1752. Another thing that happened then was a famine. The crops failed in Ohio. There was a pestilence, smallpox struck Ohio and Detroit. And we know from Deliri's diary that 20 to 30% of the people in Coshocton died. All the graves were still visible, and the rest of the people fled. The town was empty, and the death was everywhere, and Coshocton was wiped out. It was gone. In fact, all central Ohio was desolated, empty. Traders passing through the area the next year reported there was no one there. They had no one to trade with. Well, for the next 5 years, really, it stays empty. But in 1758, the British took Fort Duquesne and turned it into Fort Pitt. And it became clear to the Delaware that the flood of settlers was going to press on them. And so they were looking for a new homeland. The Wyandots, who had run eastern Ohio as a hunting ground, invited the Delawares to come and settle because they wanted to have a buffer state. So in 1758-59, the Delawares began to move to Coshoctonia. And they were pushed west by settlers. And so the contrast is, the earlier settlers, Indians came attracted by goods. The Delaware later were pushed by settlers. And the Coshoctonia, then the northern part and the southeastern parts, that is the Tuscarawas and Wahunding valleys and east of the Muskingum River, was inhabited by Delawares. And the Shawnees in the southwestern part of Coshoctonia settled and built Wakatomica, which was a major Shawnee town. And I'll just point out, I'll try to connect it in later, but many of these Shawnees came from Alabama, where some Shawnees had taken refuge earlier. Now, for the next 20 years or a little more, the history of the Delaware Nation and the Coshocton kind of merged together. So we'll hear an awful lot about what they did. Well, troubles hadn't ended yet. We're just moving right along. In 1763, wars began again. Pontiac's War was basically started by the British General Amherst, who decided that he wanted to eliminate gifts and sales of powder and lead and arms to the Indians. And they saw that as basically someone trying to oppress them, and started to revolt. That revolt was widespread in Detroit, all the British forts really around the lakes. Fort Pitt was besieged by the Delawares in 1763. Colonel Bouquet, we all know who he is. He was at the time second in command he was in command by this time because prior General Forbes had passed away. He was ordered west to break the siege at Fort Pitt, and he did have a victory at Bushy Run, which is in the eastern Pittsburgh suburbs. At least a few years ago, it was still a very nice state park to visit, which I did. Anyway, even after he broke the siege and Fort Pitt was free again, the raids continued. The Indians continued to raid the frontiers, and that caused the British High Command to order Colonel Bouquet to invade Coshoctonia with a large army of 1,500 men, which he did, and he was a very, very accomplished soldier and could do that and knew how to do that without being ambushed. The Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo sued for peace. Once they saw the size of the army, they said, we can't win. Let's get peace. And so they agreed to deliver up all their captives and also some chiefs as hostages. And Colonel Bouquet and the army returned to Fort Pitt. And now years of peace follow in Coshoctonia. The population expands, and Coshoctonia becomes, except for the Shawnee town at Wakatomica, becomes a Delaware homeland. At this point, for these years, the Delaware Nation and their leaders began a period of introspection because they saw their numbers had continued to fall for many, many years, and they had to look at their survival and figure out a way to survive. And the problems they identified were their numbers. They didn't have enough people in the area. Their reliance on hunting was a problem. Reliance on imported goods, that is, they had to, hunt for deer skins in order to get something to sell to the British, to get cloth and powder and lead and all those, knives and tomahawks and all those things they'd come to rely on. Their towns weren't permanent, and every 20 years or so, they'd have to move the towns because of shortages of firewood, and the land had to be replenished. And this caused a problem with squatters. Whenever you moved these towns and did things, you'd leave large vacant areas, which were then very attractive for squatters to come and settle. And so settlers who were just poor people looking for land would come and build houses. And so then you'd have to fight them, which would cause trouble. And the other one was there were simply no barriers. Once the Allegheny Mountains were crossed, the flow of settlers was very hard to stop. But the fundamental thing that underlies almost all these things is the population density of that was workable with Indian technology at the time was very low. And it's due to you had to have a sustainable deer population. If you overhunted, you'd run out of deer skins, and you couldn't buy your powder and lead. And biologists have worked out that you really, to have the Indian technology couldn't support more than about 2 people per square mile. 2 people per square mile. So that means in Coshocton County, there's 567 square miles. It couldn't really support more than about 1,100 Indians, which is a problem because, for example, in 1820, Coshocton County, with the pioneers living there, had 7,000 or 8,000 people. So then that had a density of 10. So it's a huge pressure difference. And this really, and I don't know why, it seems to me this is the fundamental problem that Native Americans had to face, is that once the Europeans had a foothold, their population densities are so much higher that it's either adapt and change or be pushed aside. Now, the solutions that Delaware came up with were logical ones, that they needed to get the European technology. They needed craft skills like barrel making or wheel making, things like that. They needed blacksmith skills. They needed education. They needed a written language in order to be able to administer larger numbers of people. They needed draft animals for both meat and for manure, and also they needed sheep to get wool so they could make their own cloth. They needed to develop 3- and 4-field farming. European villages with 3- and 4-field farming are permanent. They don't have to be moved. And they needed land tenure. They needed some higher power to say, this is your land, and be willing to defend them. Now, all except the last one, they recognized they could solve with the Moravian missionaries. They had experience with the Moravian missionaries in Pennsylvania, and they also interviewed a number of other missionaries. And what they decided, though, was the Moravians were safer because they didn't allow white people in their towns. The only white people allowed in one of the Moravian towns were people who had completely adopted the Indian lifestyle. For example, a captain. So now there's a Delaware revival in Coshocton. The nation is reviving in these 10 years of peace from 1764 to 1774. And they, in 1772, they invited the Moravians under David Zeisberger to come, and they wanted 2 things. They wanted people and technology. And this shows you, this picture on the left is one of the restored houses in Schönbrunn, which I really urge you to visit. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to see. I think I've been there 3 or 4 times. Every time I come to Coshocton, it seems like. Anyway, the missionaries, the Zeisberger and the Moravians, they brought hundreds of Delawares and Mohicans with them from Pennsylvania. These are the people who were in the prior communities and prior villages of converts. These were all converted Christians already. They came to Schönbrunn and Gnadenhutten and basically set up the villages, and the new skills were being learned. The written language was being created. And near the end of this period, a visionary new leader comes to the Delaware, Captain White Eyes. And he wasn't part of the original group that invited the Moravians, but he recognized how valuable they would be for his people. And he saw, here's a quote from him, he saw that their way of living could not answer much longer. Game grew scarce. They could not much longer pretend to live by hunting, but must farm. He was a very visionary person who recognized how the Delaware had to change. Now here is his mark. We know a lot about him. This is from the treaty, which I'll describe later. And this eye, it actually has a very faint circle around it, you can't see, but that is the mark he put on the treaty as a signature of his name. Well, the Moravians, they're in Coshoctonia, settled down, and there 1774 comes, and there are conversions. It's a year of conversions and conflict. There are, the missionaries, of course, wanted to convert Indians, Delaware, to Christians, and they did succeed. They had high-profile conversions. Glikikin was the number 2 man of the Wolf tribe, and Ekpalawayan is the speaker of the Great Council of the Delaware people. And these conversions troubled other Delaware leaders because they were wondering, and a debate began that ran for a whole year. Are Christian Indians still Indians? And they were trying to sort out this problem to decide whether Christian Indians could still participate in the Great Council and have all the other rights of regular Indians. At the same time, another war began. The British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, became very aggressive in the Pittsburgh area. He basically took over Fort Pitt from Pennsylvania. He started raising militia and really was inciting the settlers there to fear things. And unfortunately, the settlers took things into their own hands. They started attacking Indians, thinking that, well, there's going to be a war, we'll get them first. The problem is a bunch of them basically murdered the Mingo chief. I'm sorry, I've got to admit somebody here. A bunch of this backwoodsmen murdered the family of the Mingo chief Logan. They were just innocent people, and they were murdered for no reason at all in their town on the Ohio River. And that then meant the Mingos went on the warpath and started attacking settlers, attacking across into Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The Shawnee also went on the warpath. Some of their people were killed by the same groups, and they then started vigorously attacking Kentucky. Well, Lord Dunmore, he pulled together his militia and armies, and the first army that he sent in response to these attacks was he sent an army into Ohio from Wheeling, and it basically went to attack the Shawnee town of Waukatomica. It did so. It was led by a very competent colonel named Angus MacDonald, and it was very successful. With very little loss, he destroyed Waukatomica, but he also, through negotiations and his wisdom, and the diplomats of the Delaware chiefs named Winganon, the Delaware towns that were only 10 miles north of Waukatomica were saved. And this was a very great diplomatic success for the Delaware people. And then the Delaware chiefs, White Eyes and Captain Pipe, proceeded to help Lord Dunmore in his other efforts in Ohio, in the Scioto Valley, and brought about a peace there as well without a major destruction of the Shawnee towns. And so they were credited with much success and admiration by Lord Dunmore. Well, let's take a break from our path in time, and just look at what is in Coshoctonia at a particular time, January 1st, 1775. And we know this because we have a map. This map is a French map. You can see it's in French. It says Equis du Muskingum. And here is Coshoctonia. And you might not be able to read this, but you can read it in the book because I made a very high resolution scan. And here is Rivière de Coshocking. Well, doesn't that sound a lot like that old word Coshocka? This map seems to have been based on an old French map, and but it's also been adapted with the help of Captain White Eyes. The legend down here, it says that, it tells us it was adapted with the help of Captain White Eyes, and he's given us the names of the towns in Coshoctonia at this time. And up here are the Moravian missions, and then down here is Newcomers Town, and then Vieille de White Eyes, that's White Eyes Town. And then just a little further downriver is Vieille de Coshocking. And that is actually not the modern Coshocton. It's not even Coshocton, which is built a little later. That's a town north of the river, which was formed in 1772 by people who left Newcomers Town because they were unhappy with the Moravians coming. They wanted to get away from the missions. And then up on the Walhunding, we have Vieille de Old Hotting. That's just a corruption of Walhunding. Caucusing, which again is Cocosing, which is the Owl Town. And then south of the Forks, we have Vieille de Mokwesing, which is basically on both sides of the river around where Conesville is. And those are the, notice there's no Wakatomica. Well, Wakatomica was burned in the summer of 1774, and so this map was made after that. And also notice there's no Coshocton at the Forks, well, because that was formed in April of 1775. So those two facts let us date this map to about January 1st, 1775. So it's wonderful to have a map of the area of Coshoctonia known at a particular time. Well, 1775 begins and it becomes a year of resolution and revolution. The Great Council of the Delaware, after much debate, decided that Christian Delawares are Delaware Indians of full rights. They set up their full rights of religious freedom. They were just accepted, completely accepted. And in fact, some of the chiefs began urging more Delawares to convert. Coshocton was founded by the Delaware on April 7th of 1775. Now this is the second Coshocton. The first Coshocton was the Wyandotte town of 25 years earlier. Now Coshocton is how David Zeisberger, who's a native German, writes it, but English speakers pronounced the word, and this is known at the time, they pronounced it Coshocking or Coshocking or Coshocking. Coup, and that is very reminiscent to that word Coshocton, which was written by Delaware in 1755. So that tells us how this word was pronounced by the Delaware. And then the revolutions began. April 19th, we get the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which is 1775, which starts the Revolutionary War. And then in October of that year, Captain White Eyes declared Delaware independence from the Iroquois Six Nations. Yeah, for decades, the Six Nations had claimed an overlordship over the Delaware, and they wanted to get away from that. And he took the advantage of the Wyandotte land, Moravians, the new capital, to basically, in a treaty at Fort Pitt, declare independence. 1776, in Ohio, we have Lichtenau was formed, and we have new leaders for the Delaware. The town of Lichtenau was built in spring of 1776. It's only 2 miles south of Coshocton. It was built, and at this time, the Delaware chiefs wanted the Moravian town nearby before they wanted it further away. And the reason they wanted it nearby was they saw that it was a success. They wanted Lichtenau to be a center of technology transfer where Delawares coming to Coshocton could go down there and see what was happening and see what advances were being made and what an attractive place it was, an attractive lifestyle. It was a showcase for the future of the Delaware nation. And that nation changed somewhat. They had Netawatwace, who was the great leader, passed away at Fort Pitt in October, and he was between 90 and 100 years old and actually remembered William Penn. And then new leaders were announced for the Delaware Nation, which now is under Captain White Eyes as the great leader. And we have 3 new names, which will appear later on and appear many times in the book. John Kilbuck Jr. is made the head of the Turtle tribe. Wellapachecan is the head of the Turkey tribe, and Captain Pipe is the head of the Wolf tribe. And Captain White Eyes introduced all these chiefs to the Iroquois and to Pennsylvania and Virginia at the treaties at Fort Pitt. Now they took a policy, a pro-American policy, and what they wanted was American land recognition, because they needed that last element in the solution, land tenure. The period 1775 to 1776 is a period of peace and war. The Revolutionary War grew, but there were many in the first part of the period declarations of peace. In 1775, I already mentioned, there was a treaty of neutrality. In 1776, White Eyes visited Congress in Philadelphia and recognized the U.S. as an independent nation, distinct from Great Britain. And Congress recognized the Delaware nation as a nation as well. So this was very early diplomacy between two nations. In March 11th of 1777, Delaware neutrality was declared. Now this is commemorated on a bronze plaque on that large stone at the where Main and Second intersect, that the Great Council declared neutrality in the Revolutionary War. And at the same time, the Shawnee and Iroquois had declared neutrality, so that the Indian nations were staying out of it. But the British began to push. They were having the Burgoyne's campaign down the Hudson Valley, and they wanted help from the Indians all around to start doing raids. The raids would then help keep the militia at home, and the militia would not be able to help the colonial armies defeat Burgoyne. So the British began pushing and paying the Indians to attack the settlements. And then a disaster occurred, November of 1777. The Shawnee peace leader Cornstalk was murdered by the militia at a fort on the Ohio River. He had gone there, he had wrongly been taken captive, and then when something else happened, they rushed into the fort and killed him and his son. And this is one of those many things that when you read the history, you see over and over again where, you know, a bunch of hotheads, big mouths, go in and murder some Indian innocent chief. And the people who pay are the settlers. Hundreds of settlers later on lose their lives because the Indians are seeking revenge. Anyway, the Shawnee go to war, which is a disaster for Kentucky. 1778 is a period of alliance and breakdown. The Wyandotte, Shawnee, and Mingo are raiding across the Ohio River, causing much pain in the settlements. But on the positive side, George Rogers Clark captures forts, British forts in southern Illinois and Indiana. And these had a very large impact in Ohio, and because he dealt with the Indians in those areas fairly well. It showed great weakness of the British, and the Western Indians started to wonder if the British could really win the war. And Clark appears later on in the history of Coshocton, and it's something that I didn't, until I did the research, didn't really fully appreciate what an impact these things had. And after that, the US planned to attack Detroit. Those plans developed, but to do that, they needed an alliance with the Delaware. And so they made a treaty in 1778, and the treaty, it's a famous treaty. It should be a lot more famous, actually. Articles of Confederation and Alliance, and it basically provided that the Delaware would support the Americans, and eventually they could become a 14th state. 14th state. So all this activity with Clark capturing the forts and the Americans planning to attack Detroit basically made some of the Western Indians start to think, are they on the right side? And the Wyandotte began to talk peace. However, the prospect of an army going through the area scared Captain Pipe in Wingenum and his groups who lived in the wool hunting area. They didn't want to be in the way of an army coming through, and they broke off and went west, and that caused some problems in the Delaware nation. But the army advanced anyway into Ohio, and I'll show you its path in the next slide. It advances from Fort Pitt into Ohio, and White Eyes is made a colonel. The Delaware are very happy. Their warriors with White Eyes leading it are escorting the army. And another murder occurs. Captain White Eyes is murdered. This is an absolute disaster. Sometime around November 5th or 7th, 1778, he's murdered. The murder was hidden for 12 to 15 days. When eventually they let out that he's dead, they say he died of smallpox, but that's not possible, because we know from a long lost diary of Colonel Morgan in 1776 that White Eyes had already had smallpox and survived. And when you have something like a disease like that and survive, you have a lifetime immunity. So that's not possible. And in fact, a few years later, Colonel Morgan actually in other letters admits that he was murdered by the militia. So this has caused, of course, this murder causes great consternation for the American general, General McIntosh, because he's got an army in the middle of the field, and all of a sudden the leader of his ally is killed by his own people. And what would happen, of course, if they found out about that, they'd attack with great force, and it would be an absolute disaster. But in any case, that leads to the building of Fort Lawrence. The path the U.S. Army took was from Fort Pitt here. They went up the river to built Fort McIntosh, and then came across this way. And somewhere out here, White Eyes died, was murdered. And the General McIntosh had been planning to go to Coshocton and build a fort there, because under the treaty, he was obligated to build a fort to protect the Delaware women and children, so that their warriors could go with him in his further moves toward Detroit. But in the field, he realized he couldn't continue on to Detroit. So he basically had to stop, and he built a fort at Bolivar called Fort Lawrence, which had some use as a part of a supply chain to attack Detroit, but it was just in the wrong place. In the first place, let me see if I can get my cursor here back. There it comes. I don't know why it goes away. In the first place, well, it's too far to be supplied. It's too far from Fort Pitt and Fort McIntosh, and it's too far from Coshocton, where you could draw on the Moravian towns in the Delaware for supplies. It also does nothing to protect the settlements, because it's out of the way. The raiding parties came down the Mohunding into the Coshocton area, and then across into western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And up at Bolivar, you're out of the way. You're not in the warpath. You can't block them. And you're 3 days march from Coshocton, so you can't protect the Delaware. So unfortunately, the fort's simply built in the wrong place. However, it was built, and it's really, this fort is the only major military action in Coshoctonia. And they actually go through a siege in the spring of 1779 and survive. And it's quite an interesting, I spent quite a bit of time describing that, the events of the siege. It's really very interesting. And one of the reasons it survived was the diplomacy of the Delaware people, the Delaware chiefs, who were able to convince the Indians they were on the wrong side. Okay, back on our timeline, 1779 to 1780 is a period of diplomacy and discord. The first major event is the British commandant of Detroit, Henry Hamilton. His nickname was the Hair Buyer. He is actually captured by George Rogers Clark at Vincennes as Clark's army retakes Vincennes. Fort Lawrence survives a siege. I mentioned that. The Delaware, after Fort Lawrence survived the siege, the Delaware chiefs visited Philadelphia. They met George Washington. They addressed Congress, and this visit really helped the Delaware maintain the morale of themselves, and it also made it look like the Americans were winning the war in the West. And it was so clear with the fort and the visit. The Wyandottes and the Cherokee came to ask for peace, and they actually signed treaties because they thought they wanted to get back on the winning side. However, the command at Fort Lawrence in the West, Fort Pitt, changed. The General McIntosh left, and there was no general put back in, which was really a very bad move. And General Brodhead, he had no interest in any kind of expeditions west. His main motivation was to lead a campaign in Pennsylvania. He was from Pennsylvania and wanted the fame. So he arranged through various ways, which I describe in the book, to abandon Fort Lawrence. And he was also somewhat corrupt. He was court-martialed. His associates also diverted many supplies, and that's one of the reasons why the fort was undersupplied, and also there were no supplies available for the Delaware. And he would constantly announce missions to the West, and then he would cancel them. So after a while, people said, well, and whenever he announced a mission, they didn't bother to volunteer anymore because they knew he was going to cancel them. But that's just simply because he had no interest in that area. He's looking for his own aggrandizement. And so you go from the summer of 1779 looking like a winner, you're going to win in the West, and by the spring of 1980, it looked like America was going to lose. The Indian raids began again, causing great problems. Lichtenau, so many raiding parties came through Coshocton that Lichtenau had to be abandoned because it was too dangerous, and things were not going well at all. 1781 to 82 is another year of disaster in Coshoctonia. And I'll just quickly go through these. The Delaware Nation had a coup because of the lack of supplies by Colonel Broadhead. Captain Pipe replaced John Kilbuck, and they declared they were going to join the British. Colonel Broadhead heard about that, and finally he now can have an expedition into the West. He gets 300 men and some supplies, and they attack and burn Coshocton, or Coshocton. They burn Lichtenau had been reoccupied by the Indians, and they burned it too. Most of the warriors escaped because the raid didn't quite get the surprise he needed. They escaped to Sandusky to fight again, and then after that he then returned. But Coshocton, the second Coshocton, was wiped out, and it was never reoccupied for a very long time. Next, later that summer, the British decided that with Coshocton gone, they needed to get a free hand in the area, and they wanted to get rid of the Moravian missions. So they sent an army, a force of Indians, and British officers, and they took the missionaries, Weisberger, John Hegenwilder, and others captive, forced them to move to Sandusky. Almost all the converts, hundreds of people, followed, but they had to abandon the crops, which were ripening, and they were all plopped down in a field south of Sandusky with no food, no supplies, no nothing. They were starving. The accounts show a tremendous famine, but they remembered those crops they had back on the Tuscarawas, and they first sent some exploratory missions to see if it was safe, and they were successful. So then they went in very large numbers in February to harvest those crops and take them back to Sandusky to keep their people from starving. And unfortunately, the Pennsylvania militia learned about them being there and sent a large army who proceeded to take them all captive and murdered them all. And this is one of the great tragedies to occur, and it's certainly one of the worst events in American history. This is what I call the Massacre of the Innocents, where 96 old men, women, and children were simply murdered for no reason at all, except they were Indians. And some of the ones killed were friends of the Americans who had visited Congress. You had Glickhican, Welapachican, and Ekpalawayan chiefs who were long-term friends of the Americans were murdered as well. And after that, Coshoctonia is empty. But let's just take a look now on what could have happened. The Delaware, everything was going so well by 1778. The strategy they had adopted was working. It was working beautifully. The populations were increasing. They were developing, learning technologies, getting a written language. Everything was doing great. But then time just ran out. Three things occurred, which war, discord, and expediency crushed this great opportunity. It was really a great opportunity in human relations. It could have changed the complete tone of Indian white relations forever, had it been given a chance to succeed. But the Revolutionary War tidal wave rolled over the Delaware at Coshoctonia. Dissension split the nation, and the expediency led the Americans to break the treaty and not supply them. But I'll point out this: we have evidence it could have worked. Given without these problems, it could have worked, because the Kanawaka-Motup town that Mary Harris lived in, that still exists. There are 7,000 Mohawks living in a town near Montreal, but they had land tenure, and they didn't have the problems of war. That town still exists. They still speak Mohawk, they teach Mohawk, and I've actually corresponded with their leaders. So I think that's proof that the idea could have worked had it been given a chance, but it didn't. That's just the historical fact. It wasn't given a chance. 1782 to 1797, 15 years, vacant again. It almost sounds like a country western song, unfortunately. Vacant again. Coshocton is empty. We know this because there are a few traders go through, and eventually sometimes they set up a trading post which lasts about 4 months, and then they're robbed and murdered. John Leith's diary, he's the White Indian. I've mentioned him in some other talks and in the articles in the review. Passed through the area, but there really was nothing else in the whole area. America needed land to sell, though. It needed land to sell to pay its war debts. And they needed to force the Indians to sell. The Indians, they didn't agree. They had been defeated in the war. They'd said the British had no right to give that land away, which are, two facts on their side. So there was the American armies. They sent 2 armies to try to force the Indians to sell. They were both defeated, but the Third Army, again, the resources, the Third Army under General Wayne defeated the Indian nations of Northwest Ohio at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Then all those nations then agreed, and they all agreed to cede this land to this large part of Ohio to the United States. And this is the area. It's this area here. The boundary line went down the Cuyahoga River, and then onto the Tuscarawas to Bolivar, and then went west, and then went south to the Ohio River. And Coshocton is over here, and almost all of it, except the portion in Holmes County, is in this land that was ceded in the Treaty of Greenville. And the United States then organized the survey of 1797, because in order to sell land, they had to have surveys so they could specify what land is being sold. That brings in the pioneers. We have a new pioneers in 1798 to 1810, this period I'll call it. The first is really Ebenezer Zane, who was commissioned to mark out Zane's Trace, which started out really as an Indian trail and became a horse trail. And he was then, in compensation, given the right to build ferries over the major river crossings, which was Wills Creek, which is Cambridge, Zanesville, which is the Muskingum, and then Lancaster, which is the Hockhocking, and then I think it was Chillicothe over the Scioto. I could be wrong about that. In any case, the U.S. military district was created, and they then proceeded to try to sell the land. And it didn't go so well at first. Some things never change. The original plan was really geared not so much to sell land to normal soldiers, but to make Eastern speculators rich. They wanted to sell it, try to force the soldiers to sell out their warrants for small amounts to big speculators who would buy big pieces. And that didn't really work very well at all. Eventually, they passed a law to make land sales open up. It was called the Congress lands in 1803. And that really started the wave of settlement in Coshocton, because people could basically show up at the land office and buy the land without having to go through all these other machinations with speculators. Goshen in Tuscarawas County was founded and settled in 1798. There was David Zeisberger and John Kilbuck and a band of Delawares from Canada, where they'd gone during all the times of troubles, came back to the Tuscarawas, and on land Congress gave them, and settled Goshen. And then I'm just going to mention a few names because there's many hundreds, and the Genealogy Society, I'm sure, can provide a much better list. But again, I just some examples here of settlers and pioneers coming. Around this time, 1800, Charlie Williams, the famous first settler of Coshocton, settled at the Forks. Baker and Evans families in eastern Coshocton County around 1801. And the Butler extended family in 1803 to 1805. And this is a drawing of my triple great grandfather, Benjamin Butler, when he was 82 years old in 1862. He was born in 1779 and came to Ohio around 1803. And eventually he actually went on to Knox County, where he was one of the founders of Mount Vernon. And you can see him here. Some people say I look like him, and that's probably true. But another famous settler, in fact, the most famous settler of all is Johnny Appleseed. He came because the vacant land, there were plenty of vacant land. He could plant his apple seeds. Settlers needed to buy seedlings to get a leg up starting orchards. And I'll tell you, when you go out and talk to people in Massachusetts or New York or other places, and you say you're from where the place that Johnny Appleseed lived, they perk up. They know that. Whereas, you know, that's one of the main ones. Anyway, I've done that. And I've had that experience, and you know, I urge everyone to realize that Johnny Appleseed, his whole career and life and fame arose from his time in Coshoctonia. Okay, now we nearing the end of the frontier period. In 1811, the third Coshocton is founded. That's the Coshocton that exists now, Coshocton County. And the village that was at the Forks was renamed Coshocton and became the county seat. But the frontier, you know, where you were in the frontier depended on how far you were from that boundary line. If you were near the northern edge of that, near the edge of that boundary line, it still seemed like frontier. But if you were 50 miles or 70 miles south, like Zanesville, it didn't seem like a frontier anymore. So in the north, there still is a frontier. And there's more troubles and wars to come. Unfortunately, William Henry Harrison was extremely greedy for lands. He wanted to settle, he wanted more lands for more settlers so he could have Indiana become a state. So he forced a number of very unfair land cessations on the Indians, and they became very upset that they were losing all their lands. And this led to Tecumseh organizing his resistance around this time. And word of his resistance being organized passed in through Coshoctonia and caused blockhouses like the Old Stone Fort to be built. The War of 1812, of course, really started in the east, but it commenced very quickly in Ohio. Hull, the governor, was recruited an army, and many people in Coshoctonia, many people enlisted in that, in the militia, and served in that army. They went north into Michigan to protect Detroit, but Hull basically, he became completely entranced by Tecumseh, and he surrendered his army at Detroit for really no reason at all, simply because of his fear of Tecumseh and the British pressure to surrender. And that was a disaster. It led to panic on the frontiers. Everyone thought that the Indians were going to come and raid like they had done in the Revolutionary War. Many militias were formed. The blockhouse at Mansfield was built for protection. People went to what they called that line, that Mansfield line, to defend the frontier. And unfortunately, it led to more murders. Unfortunately, a Native American found in the wrong place could be summarily killed. And it's one of those things that you just read so much of it. It happens so often. It's very troubling. But there was no major invasion. There really wasn't. It was all fear and talk. In 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British Navy at Put-in Bay, those are islands north of Sandusky. And by defeating the British Navy there, that prevented the British Navy from supporting their army and forces at Detroit. So they had to let the Americans take Detroit and invade Canada, which really ended the war in the West. That was the end of it. There was a treaty, more land cessations, and the frontier moved far, far to the west. And then, of course, so did Johnny Appleseed. He had to have sparsely populated areas really to seize, to do his profession. He moved up into Richland County, and then later more into northwestern Ohio, and eventually to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he passed away in the 1840s. And the last thing I'll just quickly mention, the canals came, of course, 1820, the canals came and the National Road came. But that's the end of the frontier, and that's the end of the 16,000 years of Coshocton history. So if I can stop now before going on to the prizes, if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So Reba, if you can see if there are any questions, I'll answer them.
There was a question in the comments about the 1778 Colonel White Eyes versus Captain White Eyes. They want to know, are they the same person or are they different?
Oh, it's the same person. The Indian rank was captain. He was given a rank by the Americans of colonel. But out of habit, I've always called him Captain White Eyes because that's what he always was. He was a war captain for the Delaware Nation. He was never actually a formal chief, but because he was he had the vision and he had the leadership, he was considered the leader of the Delaware Nation. But again, the difference is just the nation. The Americans made him a colonel, but from the Delaware to call him, he was a captain. So that's all. Same guy. Anything else? Okay.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I raised my hand.
Well, I can't see any of that, so I've just opened the screen in front of me.
You'd mentioned that one of the issues that Delaware had when they vacated villages was squatters would come. Who were those people?
Oh, those were backwoodsmen in Pennsylvania and Virginia, people that were just poor people looking for land. And they would take advantage of those vacant lands. If they found and thought they were abandoned, they could just move in and build a cabin and start planting crops. But just normal people.
Europeans.
Oh yeah. I'm backwoodsman from Pennsylvania. Sure, they're European descent people, Scotch-Irish from Pennsylvania primarily, I think.
Scott?
Yes.
What were the Indian settlements in Conesville?
Oak Wysing. There were a number of towns there over the years. They moved them around, again, as I mentioned, fairly often. And they were very well known. I think a lot of them were, they were Munsee towns, which was a branch of the Delaware Nation versus the Unamis. Mokwesing, by the way, means Wormtown. I don't know why. They were reportedly at the time they were there were white caterpillars around, and so it was named. The name in Delaware means Wormtown. I've asked people who live in near Conesville now if they've ever seen anything like that, and they tell me they haven't. So it'd be interesting. I don't think anyone's really looked that hard. I haven't had a chance to.
Scott,
sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say we have a few questions in the chat. Chris Sykes is wondering about how big the stone is in regards to the Warsaw Warrior. How big is that?
It's not all that big. I guess from memory, I would say it's maybe about 8 inches diameter, something like that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's actually, when I saw it at first, I said, this looks a lot like a Native American version of the Narmer palette, which is that famous palette from the first generation of Egyptian kings. It's not as fancy, but it's a flat stone, and it's looked like, but I mean, that's just me trying to make connections, but 8 inches or so. You can see it, by the way, I forgot to mention, the Walhunding Valley Historical Society Museum in Warsaw, it's there. All those artifacts from the Cullison side are in a cabinet in that museum, and you can go there and look at those whenever they're open nowadays. Nigel Brush donated them all on loan, so I urge you to go see it. It's faint, but it's very distinctive.
And I think that right now they are open by appointment. So I think you have to contact them.
It would just be open on Sunday afternoon for 3 hours or something like that.
Don White wanted to know if your book is available at the museum. It will be. We don't have them in yet.
Well, they are shipping you a box full of books. I'm not sure from how long it takes to get from Sugar Creek to your museum. They probably should be shipped by UPS. And they went out today.
We should have them probably next week. If you want to pre-order one, you can send us an email at jhmuseum@jhmuseum.org, and we can actually put you on a list. And that way, when they come in, we can get them to you. We have another question from Betsy. She said that she has a high school classmate whose family is from Coshocton. The last name is Fowler, and he says they moved into the area late 1700s. Is that name familiar to you?
Yeah, one of my ancestors is a Fowler, Richard Fowler. So yeah, I researched all that whole line. They came in. He's actually mentioned in my book. There's a couple of interesting stories about him that I put in that I had found when I did my own work. So yeah, yes, it's familiar to me. There are many Fowlers in Coshocton County.
Brian said, I was curious if there were many land grants for soldiers granted within Coshocton County following the Revolutionary War.
Oh yeah, well all the land was designated for land grants for Revolutionary soldiers, but most of the soldiers sold their land to these rich speculators. But some did take up the land. I mean, a couple of my ancestors were Revolutionary War people, and they took up some of the land, but I haven't really researched how many there are or different ones, but I'm sure when you read the county histories, there's a large number of times you'll run across where so-and-so was a Revolutionary War soldier. There's a very large number of Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Coshocton County.
And then D. Jennings asked where Mary Harris was from. And they also want to go back to the slide of your great-great-grandfather and want to see if you look like him. They want to do a little comparison.
I don't know if you can see me, though. You probably can. I don't know whether they can see me.
I know I can see you right now. You're on your two screens.
Well,
it's
possible. Previous.
Yeah.
There he is. Well, I don't have long hair like that. I did when I was a younger guy, but I have the mustache, though. I don't know. He doesn't have one. I don't know. Some people have told me I do, but that's your call.
They said, "Oh yes, unmistakable."
There was another. Oh, the Mary Harris. She was. I'll get to that. Just hold off. Where she was from, I'll tell you that, but in the next when I introduce the prizes.
Right.
Any more?
Any other questions? Anybody else have any other questions?
Well, I really urge you to get the book and read the book. I donate everything to the museum, so I don't really make any money on that. It's I suppose they call it a labor of love. But and it's 600 pages long, and it's just a colossal amount of information. And the key thing is the people involved. I think you'll really enjoy reading about the people and their thoughts and their own words and all that. And I could just cover the highlights in this talk, but I think the part about the book covers is in great depth about all the people involved in the Coshocton frontier. Was it time to move on to the prizes, Reba?
Yeah, looks like it.
Okay, Mary Harris. Who was Mary Harris? I'll remind you all, she was the first Coshochtonian. She lived there 1745 to 1752. She was born in Massachusetts, was living in Deerfield, Massachusetts when it was raided by the French and Indians in 1704. As a 10-year-old girl, she was taken captive back to Kanawaka near Montreal. She became a Mohawk. She married, converted to Catholicism, raised a family, and lived peacefully for 30 years. In 1744, she documented that she visited Massachusetts with a peace message from the chiefs of Kanawaka to the governor of Massachusetts. In 1745, she then, with her family, moved to Coshoctonian. And one of the reasons, besides being invited to by the French, is that there was a war coming in New England between Massachusetts and New France. And if you were people who had relatives on both sides, you would be very uncomfortable. So there is some thought that maybe that's why her family went to Ohio. In 1751, she meets Christopher Gist in Coshoctonia. 52, the pestilence and war, it seems like she moved back to Kanawaka with her family. But she's known to be in Kanawaka, though, back in Montreal in 1756, because one of her sons, who was a great war leader for the Kanawaka, had an English prisoner, and he let him stay at their house, and she was very kind to him. Now, this is not Mary Harris, this is Natalie Wood in that great movie of 1956, The Searchers, but she has that look, that stern look, and so I've kept that. Anyway, that's who Mary Harris is, and then we have the prizes, which I sponsor every year, writing prizes, the Mary Harris writing prizes. This year it's $3,500 in prizes. We increased it. There were so many good essays, it was very difficult to make decisions. So one way to make a decision is by just adding more prizes. So that's what we did. First, there are, I've got the prizes now. I'm going to announce the $1,000 to the first place prize. I'm just going to go down the list and introduce each prize. Starting at first, this is Erin Gottwalls wrote a fine essay called History Underfoot, and she will receive the $1,000 cash prize. You'll have to make arrangements to go visit the museum to pick up the prizes and the certificates. Number two, second place, we decided to increase that prize to $700, and that will go to Megan Bookless for her fine essay about Chalfont's Church in Coshocton County. We created a third place prize, which for $400, which will go to Annalisa Hankinson for an essay, Roscoe Village, Inspiration of a Frontier. And then I have 7 honorable mentions. Again, there were so many good essays. Sorry, I've got to get some water. Okay, and I'll read those off. James Smith, Just Passing Through by Christine Sykes. There's no particular order in these. Colonel Henry Bouquet and the Black Watch with Dana Kittner. Disquiet at the Forks of the Muskingum by Pamela Morrison. Frontier Day of Infamy by Rick Bailey. Human Perception of God During Illness and Crisis by Shelley Webb. Life in Coshocton County, Ohio by Jennifer Wilkes. And Two Kings by Robbie Keel. And those are the honorable mentions, 7 of them at $200 each. So thank you very much for writing them. They were really quite a wonderful read. And the judging, basically, there's a committee of people. It's not just me. The people I know, some friends, old-time Coshoctonians. We'll just leave it at that. So, anyway, thank you. They were all wonderful to read, and please, you can make arrangements to come to the museum to pick up the cash prizes, real cash, $100 bills. And
I will be sending everybody who won a prize an email tomorrow morning. And you can just respond to that with your availability, and we can make an appointment for you to come in, and then we have a certificate for you and then your cash prize.
Okay, that's it. Normally we'd have a picture, take a picture of everybody, but we can't do that. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Well, I guess I'll sign off now.
Thank you, Dr. Butler.
How much is the
Thank
book?
you.
How much is the book?
The book is $39.99. $39.99, 600 pages. And I basically all the money, one way or another, gets donated to the museum.
You will be able to purchase the book from our website at jhmuseum.org. We have a gift shop website on there, and if you wanted to order it once we get them and get them online, you can actually do that, and we can ship them straight to your house instead of having you come in. It's really up to you on how you want to.
It's 10 cents a page, Dad.
Okay.
Let's get a half a dozen.
It's a hardcover book, by the way.
Oh man.
Yeah. It's for heirloom, an heirloom item.
Nice job.
Okay, well, thanks for coming and listening. I'm gonna figure out how to close this.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Congratulations to all the winners. We will see you next time.